Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. In 1926, I was ready to jump the first train out of Baltimore. I'd done it before, never knowing when home couldn't be home anymore. On a few occasions I hadn't even packed my bag. I had to leave immediately or never leave at all. Life was like trying to listen to the radio, which was new in those days, carefully tuning it so that the station came in clear. But every time I stepped away to sit and enjoy the program, static leapt into the channel so that I was forever moving in a vain attempt to get the station clear, and it was that constant getting up that made me increasingly desperate to sit down, until I finally switched off the radio and collapsed into my chair. I may have been disgusted with the radio, but at least I was sitting. The only real difference was that in my life I couldn't turn off that radio. I was always adjusting the dial, yet always hearing nothing. At that time I worked the night shift at a warehouse. I was the night clerk, the person responsible for signing off on the paperwork and fixing the books. One night my proverbial radio turned to static when somebody knocked on the shipping office door. That wasn't unusual. I expected to see mobsters wanting a late pickup. Mob bosses like their champagne as much as the next lush, usually because they have some pretty girls to entertain. Instead of gangsters, two respectable-seeming men entered, completely unlike the teamsters outside, meaning that they were either revenuers or missionaries. I had no reason to speak with either, but given the option, I would have preferred that they were revenuers. Those two men were important, and I would soon know them far better than I had the right to. They didn't introduce themselves then, so I'll jump in and introduce them for you. The disheveled one who sat down next to my desk like a deadbeat uncle was Slow Joe, a man who could make any well-tailored suit look like a charity store purchase. The other guy, who wore his clothes well like a blue blood, was Fancy Charlie. He said nothing, as he almost always said nothing, standing by the shipping office door. He kept his handkerchiefs well ironed, standing fashionably out of his pocket. To this day, I don't know their real names. They never told me those names nor wished to tell me. I tried asking once, but Joe just smiled and said, "Slow Joe's all you gotta know." I might have pressed on the subject, but as I went by a fake name, dropping the subject seemed like the best move. As I capped my pen, the red-faced Joe started bantering like an old friend. "Hey Bird, it's a night out there." "What a night. Rain and mist and all that. You know those really chilly days that just drive you nuts? This is one of them. So for Christ's sake, why don't you have the heat on? What kind of cheapskate do you work for?" The other thing about Joe was that he got you to answer truthfully without thinking, because he just talked that way. That made him a killer card player. "We're out of coal," I said, stating the facts. The day shift forgot to order more. Joe showed his disgust. "You need a warm bowl of soup, Bird," he said, taking out a wad of bills. "On me." "Really? Here, take a $5. Skip down to that diner on King James Street. They're open all night, and they got a smokin' dame who serves tables there. Order the franks and beans and you can't go wrong." In translation, that was a respectable way of saying, "Get lost or else." That also meant keeping the dock workers quiet. $5 was a lot, but it wasn't what it used to be. Due to inflation, money was always worth less in those days. And as a rule, when offered a bribe, never take their first offer. The boys here will wonder where I'm off to. I'll need to buy them some cigarettes. Charlie nodded at that. Joe smiled back. "Smart Bird. Here's a few more bucks. If the waitress says that she don't have no more cartons, don't take no for an answer. The diner's always got a few cartons behind the counter." He tossed in one more $1. "You gotta tip her too." That was a ridiculous pile of greenbacks just to get dinner, even with inflation. I could feed everyone for a week on that. These nobodies wanted me out the door, and I couldn't say no to that kind of money. "How long should I be gone?" I asked, having no desire to see these men again. As I already had my coat on, I waited, putting on my cheeriest disposition. Joe inspected me head to toe as I buttoned up. "Hey, you're a classy-looking guy. What's a guy like you doing down here? You must not be married. Do you have a girl?" Joe knew the answer by seeing my reaction. "I got this sister," Joe said. "She likes classy guys. How about I set you two up?" I shook my head. Dating the sister of a no-goodnik ranked high up on my list of bad ideas. Dating at all ranked higher. "Whatever you're selling, I don't want to buy it." Gentlemen, I look forward to not seeing you when I return. Call it 40 minutes. I'll be back when I'm finished with the crossword. If you feel generous, you can order some coal. Don't be like Stan. To tell the truth, on hearing that we had no heat that night, I had vowed revenge. Who forgot to order the coal? Stan Gerber, that's who. I wanted to curse that man, but the Teamsters had already cursed him with language fouler than I could rise to. I find that laborers swear with an artistry ill-met by any man who is more refined or better stationed. Those lower classes take all their feelings of rage and contempt, concentrate them into 3 words, then practice those words over and over up and down like a Negro trumpeter practicing scales. And like a Negro trumpeter, those notes sounded perfect to my ears but never perfect to theirs. There was always more cursing to be done, for those 3 words had to carry their entire experience. The Teamsters loaded trucks in miserable weather like this, their coal stove in the corner being their only respite. If you were them, you'd curse Stan Gerber too for ruining your already horrible life. That stove was the only thing that got them through the night. The Teamsters gathered around it to find some solace and to practice their cursing like a jazz band, improvising their way through the same old tune, exploring new and energizing variations, all the while saying the same things over and over. They cursed about the trucks, cursed about the crates, cursed about fragile labels, and cursed about their wives, telling the unmarried ones to stay unmarried. This was their music, where cooperation and competition existed at the same time. At least this was music to their ears. To me, like jazz, those improvisations all sounded like noise. Don't take that as a knock against jazz. That's just a knock against me. Music and I had parted early and never quite squared our differences, with organs ranking at the bottom. I worked as the shipping clerk for that warehouse. Trucks came in, I transcribed numbers into ledgers, added those numbers up, put one set of numbers in one book and a second set of numbers in a different book, then never thought about those numbers again. It was a simple job which surprisingly few people wanted. The position wasn't a union job, so I got paid worse than the Teamsters, and it also wasn't a proper management job, so I got no bonuses. That didn't bother me. I picked that job because I wanted to keep my head down and stay unnoticed. The owners valued that, so we accepted the arrangement. I worked the evening shift from 5 to whenever, which had quite a few advantages for me. First off, it wasn't the graveyard shift, which I had tried on many occasions and found wanting. My body simply refused to accept that night was day and day was night, no matter how much I tried to convince it otherwise. If nothing else, without fail, my landlady would wake me up on Sunday morning for church. At that time, landladies got fined if their boarders didn't attend church. Hardly anyone paid the fine, but it was enough to keep those landladies living in fear. This was only a small annoyance to God-fearing boarders, but for those who lived immoral lives on Saturday night, Sunday morning delivered some modicum of punishment. Rotating shifts were as bad as the graveyard shift. Given my preference, I am a creature of habit, so rotating shifts never agreed with my nature. My routine was interrupted every few weeks with a new routine. Folks told me it would get easier, but they lied. It never got easier. I distrusted working during the daytime, mostly because that made me too visible. Folks had a way of figuring out that I was smart, which led to them figuring out that I was educated. I could hide those traits, but only so well. Once my coworkers figured out that I was smart and educated, they started wondering why I was working such an odd job, and that fueled suspicions. It was always about then that I had to pack my bags and leave town. Suspicion breeds unwelcome questions, leading to unwelcome answers. Working the evening shift provided the best solution to my nature, if an imperfect one. When I worked the evening shift, I was too busy for dancing and dinners and all those sorts of things that properly civilized people do, while avoiding the drinking and gambling that uncivilized people do. That's not to say that I'm against any of those things. I'm no Methodist. That only meant that keeping away from them was in my best interest. Working the evening shift also kept me away from the girls at the boarding houses. When you are a bachelor in my age, people start asking, when are you going to get married? As much as I would have liked to get married, to settle into the family routine in some suburban bungalow, I was in no position to do so. Wherever I lived, whoever I knew, it was just temporary. Like a baseball team, I always had to be on the bus for the next town. On many nights in the tedium between trucks, I had nothing to do, so I wrote short stories, mostly for religious magazines because they bought anything. These stories were the kind of tripe that every critic belittles, and my stories deserved every one of those belittlements. The formula was simple. Some boy had an ordinary piece of life happen to him, and then learned some valuable life lesson from it. For example, a broken arm taught the reader about patience, or a fight instructed the reader about anger. Most of these stories were half-formed ideas that didn't really work, coming out little better than sermons from a bored priest. Of the ones that did work, some sold but never all. My desk drawer became the graveyard of bad ideas, but I didn't care because it was pocket money. In this job, I found the irony amusing. Here I was, a grown-up good kid writing stories about being a good kid, hiding out in a warehouse of scofflaws that smuggled alcohol into the country for all the bad kids who ran it. There was never any doubt that my employers were smugglers. Nobody pretended otherwise. I had a row of envelopes set up every week for the cops on the night shift. Everyone got their pay, and the pay was good. We didn't stiff anybody because we didn't need to. This was Maryland, and nobody in Maryland supported prohibition from the governor on downward. Yet prohibition had left many people thinking of themselves as far thirstier than they ever were before, so they responded in kind, getting far drunker than they ever needed to be. As long as the liquor flowed, the profits flowed, and that was enough for everybody except the gangs that shot each other. The desire for wealth always gives way to the desire for power. Myself, I believe that drunkenness and lack of sleep go together. When you don't get enough of either, you need more of each to catch up, although more often than not you mix them up and go off drinking when you really need sleep. By my estimates, if prohibition were ever lifted, the nation would sleep for a year. I'd vote for that if we ever got an honest election. I'd finger the communists for rigging the game, but elections were a farce long before them, and the public hating the ruling party had been around even longer. With prohibition, the warehouse always ran the risk of getting inspected by the revenuers or the church. Anyone sane would pick the revenuers. The taxmen would haul your alcohol out into the street and destroy it in a public spectacle, and the judge, after you bribed him, would give you a slap on the wrist. After that, the deal was done. The same was not true of the church inspectors, who would dig through the personal lives of every person working on your block, every employee working on the site, and their extended families, doing their best to root out every possible thread of sin and vice and everything nice, all the while failing to notice their own brutality. The church liked going after the folks without money. I'm not much of a hard vice man myself, yet all that codified church virtue bothered even me. There's a limit to what laws can do for you. Beyond that limit is a tyranny of sorts rooted in the idea that without tyranny the world reverts to utter chaos, that slippery slope down to hell polished and greased by the hands of an eager humanity. Thus great and unbending virtue must be enforced without mercy lest our entire civilization fall like Rome to the Vandals. Every step is the first step downward, and even God has no recourse to save us. Joe proved right about dinner. By the time I got there, all I wanted was a bowl of soup and some baked beans. He was right about the counter girl too. She kept her tight shirt buttoned low, more to deal with the heat in the kitchen than for any declaration of morals. She was too busy doing her job to be sexy about anything. I was too bored to see anything but sex. As I observed her that night, I noticed that she subsisted on food scraped from plates and leftover coffee. Some food she put aside for later, likely for her kids. Times were good in our country, but not for everyone. There were more people scraping by than anyone knew, and money was always worth less the next day. Thank you, communism. Knowing that I was leering, I decided to distract myself with my usual amusements. I found an abandoned paper starting into the crossword. Just so you know, I'm the kind of person that uses a pen to solve his crosswords. I'm also the kind of person that scratches out his mistakes so many times that you can't tell what I actually solved for. God help anyone who actually tries to check my puzzles. Completed, they resemble one of those psychological ink blots far more than a word puzzle. When I wrapped up the crossword, I moved on to the other puzzles to waste some extra time. I wanted those two guys long gone before I returned to the warehouse. After independence, after our new governmental order was cobbled together by madmen, I found that I needed to solve puzzles in order to keep my fingers busy. If I didn't, my mind grew restless and I began coming up with ideas and solving obscure math problems. Soon after that, my self-restraint usually proved too shallow, and I began doodling geometry on the nearest stray paper. Times being what they were, that was a pretty dumb thing to do. Folks noticed and started calling the church, thinking that I was an anarchist. There were any number of radical groups running about in those days. Early on, I had to leave a few jobs because of that academic napkin habit. Done with jumbled letters, I abandoned the word puzzles, bought a few cartons of cigarettes off the waitress by paying too much, tipped her well, then wandered back through those chilly streets, watching my breath the whole way. I walked along the trolley tracks without fear, as that line had gone out of business last autumn. As I closed in on the warehouse, I kept an eye out for anyone suspicious. Those men were certainly up to something, and I feared that I was already in their crooked game. I didn't know what they might be setting me up for, but it was certainly a setup. The Teamsters noticed me walking in. "Hey Bird. You missed a truck." What'll the bosses say? Or something like that. Their language was unrecordable. I tossed the cigarettes onto the landing. I'm not dumb. You're a scholar and a gentleman, the dockworker said. Despite the two crooks' assurances of departure, I had fully expected to see them in my office. Instead, I discovered that they had straightened out my desk, swept the floor, and cleaned the bathroom. To my greatest astonishment, my pile of bad fiction was gone. What kind of criminals stole rejected stories?